subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hello everybody, welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we shall be analyzing the Hindu newspaper dated 24th of February 2021 of the New Delhi edition. The topics to be discussed today have been presented on your screen. Timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. Let us begin our today's discussion. The first article appears on page number 7. The article is titled as "A Proper Transfer Policy Needed." This article shall be important both from the perspective of GS Paper 2, Polity and Governance, as well as GS Paper 4, Ethics and Integrity. See, civil services in any country need to have certain foundational values. The civil servants need to be non-partisan, that is, the civil servants should be able to do their duty without any kind of fear or by favoring any kind of political party. The civil servants also need to be impartial, that is, the civil servants should take decisions purely based upon merit rather than based upon their personal biases, prejudices, or the political inclinations. So the decisions as such should be fair, just, and unbiased. The civil servants also need to be neutral, that is, the civil servants should not take any action based upon their political bias. Rather than being faithful to a political party which is in power, the civil servants need to be faithful to the values enshrined in the Indian Constitution. The civil servants also must have high level of integrity, that is, there should be a coherence between thought, speech and action of the civil servants. So whatever they think, they should speak that, and they should also act in a similar manner. Now, in order to uphold these foundational values, one of the most crucial factor happens to be the security of tenure. The security of tenure means once a civil servant is appointed to a particular post, he must remain in that particular post for at least 3 to 4 years. So, the civil servants should not be frequently transferred. So, in case if there is no security of tenure and if the civil servants are frequently transferred, then it would have a number of adverse implications. For example, it may lead to development of partisan bureaucracy, where the civil servants would either take a decision based upon fear or by favoring any political party. The civil servants will not be able to take decisions in an objective manner. The civil servants may become biased towards a political party which is in power, and this also hurts the integrity of the civil servants, and thus it may lead to corruption as well as maladministration. Now, for example, all of you are studying extremely hard to clear the UPSC civil service examination. Your level of morale as well as motivation is at all-time high. You would also want to bring about certain kind of innovation in the system once you get an entry either into IAS or the IPS. But the question here is, does the system enable you to do all that? Does the system enable you to have high level of morale and motivation at all the times during your career? Does the system enable you to bring about innovation in the field of administration? Sadly not. This is so because once a person makes an entry into the field of civil services, a person may be required to follow the orders of his political bosses, and if he does not do that, the person may be frequently transferred. Similarly, if a person brings about innovation in the field of administration, and if that innovation goes against the partisan interest of the bureaucracy as well as political bosses, a person may be frequently shunted out from one ministry to another ministry. And if that happens, people's morale and motivation obviously comes down. People would be less inclined to bring about innovation in the field of administration. People may either quit the civil services or they may start adopting a status quo approach. All of these factors together lead to decline in the good governance. Accordingly, this particular article here discusses various problems with respect to lack of security of tenure given to civil servants. Accordingly, in this particular video discussion of ours, we will discuss the importance of the security of tenure, the problems with the frequent transfers of the civil servants, and what strategies should be adopted in order to ensure the security of tenure, wherein we will be discussing the recommendations put forward by the Second Administrative Reforms Commission. So based upon our video discussion, two main space questions for your practice here could be: good administration is not possible without continuity, and intelligent administration is not possible without the local knowledge. In the light of this statement, discuss the importance of the security of tenure in the civil services. The second question here is: the security of tenure is a critical factor to uphold the foundational values of the civil services. In this regard, suggest strategies to prevent the frequent transfer of the civil servants and ensure their security of tenure. Coming first to the importance of the security of tenure for the civil servants. First and foremost, as discussed before, this would enable us to uphold the foundational values of the civil services. Secondly, in the absence of security of tenure, if the bureaucrats are frequently transferred, then the bureaucrats may start taking decisions in order to please their political bosses rather than taking decisions based upon an objective criteria. Thirdly, by providing the security of tenure to the civil servants would be able to acquire the local knowledge. They would also be able to bring about innovation. Not just that, by enabling them to stay for at least 3 to 4 years in a particular post, the bureaucrats would be able to sustain whatever innovation they have brought in the field of administration. This would also lead to higher level of morale and motivation for the bureaucrats. And lastly, if the bureaucrats are frequently transferred because of political considerations, there could arise a nexus between politicians and bureaucrats, and this can in turn lead to a greater amount of corruption and reduction in their accountability. That is why the security of tenure for the civil servants is considered to be one of the most important pillars to foster the good governance in a particular country. However, as highlighted by the Second Administrative Reforms Commission, even though the bureaucrats are required to stay in a particular post for at least 3 to 4 years, the average tenure of the civil servants is less than 1 year. For example, the Second Administrative Reforms Commission has highlighted that almost 60% of the civil servants in India, they spend less than 1 year in a particular post. One of the classical example of such short tenure of the civil servants happens to be that of Ashok Khemka. Now, Ashok Khemka, who is an IS officer from the Haryana cadre, he has so far spent 27 years in the field of civil services. But you'd be surprised to know that this person has been transferred for more than 50 times in the last 27 years. So through this example, one can understand the kind of personal as well as professional turmoil which the IS officers such as Ashok Khemka pass through. Apart from that, in a landmark case known as the Mohsina Begum case, the Supreme Court of India had observed that whenever the government changes after the elections, there is a mass transfer of civil servants. Quite often, this mass transfer of the civil servants take place on number of considerations such as caste, religion, monetary considerations, and so on. So because of such mass transfer of the civil servants, just like how the Indian society is divided into caste, religion, etc., the bureaucracy also tends to get divided along the lines of caste as well as religion. So this in turn leads to disruption of unity among the bureaucrats, and also it leads to demoralization of the bureaucrats. Even the National Commission to Review the Working of Indian Constitution had highlighted the number of problems with respect to the frequent transfers of the IS officers. The National Commission to Review the Working of Indian Constitution had highlighted that this is demoralizing the civil servants and it is forcing the civil servants to adopt the status quo approach. Hence, in order to promote good governance and to provide the security of tenure to the civil servants, both the Second Administrative Reforms Commission as well as the HOTA Committee on the Civil Service Reforms have given a number of recommendations. First and foremost, in most of the states in India, the Civil Services Board have been established. the basic role of the Civil Services Board is to provide the recommendations to the Chief Minister for the posting and the transfers of the Grade A officers. But the problem here is this Civil Services Board does not enjoy the statutory status, because of which the Civil Services Board, which is headed by the Chief Secretary of a concerned state, does not have adequate amount of powers. Hence, in order to rectify this particular problem, the HOTA committee had recommended that the Civil Services Board in the states need to be provided with a statutory recognition. Different state governments in case of India would have to come out with a law in order to provide for the postings and the transfers of the civil servants. And such a law should have to create the Civil Services Board headed by the Chief Secretary. The role of this Civil Services Board should be to fix the tenure of the civil servants. And normally, the tenure of the civil servants should be at least 3 to 4 years. Whenever a civil servant needs to be transferred, the Civil Services Board needs to make recommendations for the postings as well as transfer to the Chief Minister. Ultimately, the Chief Minister should take a final call with respect to the postings and the transfers of the officers. However, if the Chief Minister does not accept the recommendations of the Civil Services Board in that particular case, the Chief Minister should give in writing the reasons for the non-acceptance of the recommendations. And lastly, whenever the civil servants are transferred before the end of their tenure, that is, in case of the premature transfers, we do not have proper grievance redressal mechanism for such civil servants. Accordingly, in order to solve this particular problem, the HOTA committee had recommended that we need to set up an ombudsman which should be headed by a retired official of a highest level of integrity and honesty. Such an ombudsman should investigate into the grievances of the civil servants who have been transferred before the end of their tenure. The ombudsman should also submit an annual report to the governor, who should in turn place a report before the state legislature. Hence, setting up of such ombudsman would act as a checks and balances on the state government from frequently transferring the civil servants. At the same time, the state governments would also be more accountable to the state legislature on the frequent transfers of the civil servants. So these are some of the strategies as recommended by the Second Administrative Reforms Commission as well as the HOTA committee. So this is what you have to know with respect to this particular article. The next article appears on page number 7. The article is titled as Being Petroleum Independent. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 3 Indian economy. India is considered to be the third largest importer of the crude oil after China and USA. The annual import of crude oil in the year 2019-20 was around 270 million metric tons, accounting for almost around $120 billion. Almost 85% of our domestic requirements of crude oil were basically met through imports. Hence, India's higher import dependence on crude oil is considered to be a setback to India's energy security as well as Atmanirbhar Bharat. For example, the higher import of crude oil would lead to higher amount of trade deficit. According to a study carried out by the Reserve Bank of India, for every $10 increase in per barrel of crude oil, India's trade deficit would increase by almost around $12.5 billion. Apart from that, as the international crude oil prices keep fluctuating on similar lines, the exchange rates in case of India would also keep fluctuating. The crude oil which is imported into India, it is considered to be a critical input both for generating electricity as well as for the purpose of transportation. So as the international crude oil prices increases, the Indian economy would witness a higher rate of inflation. And lastly, presently the Indian economy is highly vulnerable to the Indian monsoons. So whenever there is a drastic fall in the rainfall because of the failure of monsoons, this has an adverse impact on the macroeconomic stability of India. Similar to Indian monsoons, the Indian economy gets adversely affected whenever there are large scale fluctuations in the international oil prices. See, the Indian monsoon is a natural phenomena over which we obviously do not have control. But we can actually control the amount of crude oil that we import into India. This would ensure a greater amount of macroeconomic stability. In this regard, this particular article here discusses various strategies which the government should adopt in order to reduce the crude oil imports into the Indian economy. Accordingly, based upon our discussion, a mains question for your practice here could be the higher import of crude oil into India poses challenges for ensuring the energy security. In the light of this statement, discuss strategies to reduce the crude oil imports and ensure an Atmanirbhar Bharat in the energy sector. So let us discuss as to what strategies can be adopted in order to ensure the self-sufficiency in the energy sector. First and foremost, we would have to go for the diversification of our energy resources so as to reduce the import of the crude oil. As part of that initiative, first and foremost, we would have to give a greater amount of thrust on the renewable energy projects such as solar energy, wind energy, hydropower energy, biomass, etc. This would not only enable us to reduce the import of crude oil, but it will also help us meet the Paris climate change goals. Secondly, presently the government of India has come up with a vision to create a natural gas-based economy. The objective behind this government's initiative is to increase the share of natural gas in the Indian economy from the present 6% to 15% by the end of 2025. As part of such an initiative, the government is presently focusing on expanding the distribution of the natural gas through the city gas distribution networks as well as the construction of the gas pipelines. So this initiative has to be given further amount of thrust. Nextly, presently the government is implementing the ethanol blending program. As part of this particular program, ethanol up to 10% is required to be mixed with the petrol by the oil marketing companies. So this particular program has to be implemented successfully. And lastly, during the recent Union Budget 21-22, the Finance Minister has announced for the launch of the National Hydrogen Mission. Accordingly, in order to make optimum use of the hydrogen, we would have to ramp up our investment in the field of research and development. The second strategy is with respect to giving a thrust to the electric vehicles. See, presently the government of India is implementing a scheme known as the Faster Adoption and Manufacturing of Electric and Hybrid Vehicles scheme, which in short is also referred to as the FAME scheme. The objective of this particular scheme is to have at least 6 to 7 million sales of the electric and hybrid vehicles after the year 2020. And in order to push for the adoption of electric vehicles, this particular scheme basically focuses upon the demand incentive and creation of the charging infrastructure. As far as the demand incentive is concerned, usually the cost of the electric vehicles is higher in comparison to the conventional vehicles. This can act as a prohibitive factor for the buying of electric vehicles. Hence, in order to boost the demand for the electric vehicles, the government provides certain incentives to the customers. Now, for example, let's say the cost of electric vehicle is 1.5 lakh. Here, the customer may be required to pay only 1.2 lakhs. So, the remaining 30,000 is in turn reimbursed by the government to the manufacturer of the electric vehicle. Hence, the implementation of the FAME scheme would enable us to bring down the import of the crude oil. However, this particular scheme also needs certain amount of modification in order to further bring down the import of the crude oil. Now, for example, the demand incentive under the FAME scheme is in turn dependent upon the battery capacity of an electric vehicle, which means higher the battery capacity of an electric vehicle, higher would be the demand incentive provided by the government of India. So this essentially means that a person would get a higher incentive on buying of four-wheelers in comparison to a two-wheeler vehicle. This is so because the four-wheeler vehicle obviously would have a higher battery capacity in comparison to a battery which is needed for a two-wheeler vehicle. But if you look at the Indian vehicle market is basically dominated by the two-wheelers rather than the four-wheelers. So the FAME scheme, instead of providing higher incentives for the two-wheelers, it has ended up providing higher incentives for the adoption of the four-wheeler vehicles. Hence, this scheme accordingly needs a change wherein we would have to provide higher incentives to the people who are buying the electric two-wheelers. The next strategy is with respect to ensuring greater resilience against the volatility in the international crude oil prices. In order to protect India from the volatility in the international crude oil prices, we would have to build up sufficient amount of buffer stock of the crude oil. In this regard, the government of India has already come out with a vision of the strategic petroleum reserves. So the strategic petroleum reserves basically seeks to create enough amount of emergency fuel storage. So here the crude oil is actually stored in the underground rock caves along the eastern and the western coast of India. If you look at the recommendations given by the International Energy Agency, according to International Energy Agency, a particular country should have sufficient amount of emergency fuel which should be able to last for at least 90 days of its requirements. Now, through building of the strategic petroleum reserves, the Indian government has been able to build up reserves which can last for at least 87 days. So going forward, we would have to increase the overall emergency fuel storage in the Indian economy. Please do let us know in the comment section as to in which all places has the government set up the strategic petroleum reserves. The next strategy is with respect to the fuel efficiency standards. Now, in order to ensure that the vehicles are using the fuel efficiently and also reducing the carbon dioxide emissions, the government of India has laid down the CAFE norms. The CAFE norms here stands for the Corporate Average Fuel Efficiency or the economy norms. These norms have come into being in the year 2017. Under this particular norms, the average carbon dioxide emissions should be below 130 grams per kilometer till the year 2022, and beyond that it should be below 113 grams per kilometer. So the idea here is the vehicles should become at least 10% more efficient between the years 2017 to 2022, and beyond that they should become 30% more efficient. Please do note that these fuel efficiency standards are in addition to the BS6 norms laid down by the Indian government. So both fuel efficiency standards as well as BS6 norms would enhance the overall fuel efficiency of the Indian vehicles and hence would bring down the overall import of the crude oil. In addition, this particular article has also highlighted that presently the fuel efficiency standards, that is the CAFE norms, are not applicable to the two-wheelers. So in spite of the fact that the Indian vehicle market has come to be dominated by two-wheelers, these fuel efficiency standards are not applicable to the two-wheelers. So going forward, in order to further bring down the import of crude oil, we would have to extend the fuel efficiency standards to the two-wheelers. Some of the other strategies that can be incorporated include, first and foremost, we would have to increase the domestic production of oil. So as highlighted before, almost around 85% of the crude oil that we use in India are basically met through imports. Hence, we should have to reduce the share of imported crude oil and accordingly increase the share of the domestic crude oil. And this can be done by encouraging public-private partnership agreements between the PSUs and the private sector, as well as by providing greater amount of incentives to the private sector entities involved in the exploration of the petroleum and natural gas. Nextly, we would have to efficiently implement various energy efficiency measures which are presently implemented by Bureau of Energy Efficiency as well as Energy Efficiency Services Limited. And lastly, this particular article has also given a suggestion in the form of the Zero Emissions Vehicle Program. This article has highlighted that in some of the other countries such as US, China, etc., the vehicle manufacturers who are manufacturing the conventional vehicles, these vehicle manufacturers are also required to manufacture certain number of electric vehicles. Hence, same kind of policy has to be adopted even in case of India. So the vehicle manufacturers involved in the manufacturing of conventional vehicles, they should be encouraged to manufacture even the electric vehicles as well. Apart from that, if you want to know various details about the electric vehicles policy adopted by the government of India, particularly with respect to why there is a need to give a push to electric vehicles, the various government initiatives, and what are the constraints and challenges in the adoption of electric vehicles, you can go through the DNS dated 9th of August 2020. So these are some of the important aspects which one should know with respect to this particular article. The next article appears on page number 7. The article is titled as The Excise Duty Fiscal Policy Contradiction. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 3 Indian Economy. The COVID-19 pandemic has led to the twin shocks to the Indian economy. The Indian economy has registered the negative GDP growth rate for the fifth time in the economic history of India and for the first time in the last 41 years since 1979. The twin shocks has led to decline in both private final consumption expenditure as well as a decline in the investment. Both of these two happen to be the major drivers of the Indian economy. This in turn has adversely affected the government's finances. Because of the economic slowdown, the overall tax revenue collected by the Indian government, particularly the direct tax revenue, this has contracted. On the other hand, because the Indian economy is facing the economic slowdown, the government is required to adopt the counter-cyclical fiscal policy. That means the government here is required to borrow more amount of money in order to undertake expenditure, particularly undertaking more amount of expenditure on the creation of capital assets will lead to multiplier effects in terms of increasing the demand as well as supply side of the Indian economy. On account of the decline in the tax revenue as well as increase in the government's expenditure, the fiscal deficit for the present financial year has increased. The government was required to bring down the fiscal deficit to 3.5% of India's GDP in the present financial year, but the fiscal deficit has increased to 9.5% of GDP. Now, this particular article highlights that in order to compensate for the decline in the direct tax revenue, the government of India has decided to increase the excise duty, particularly on petrol and diesel. Now, both petrol and diesel are considered to be critical inputs in the Indian economy. They are used in industries, they are used in the field of agriculture, they are used for the purpose of transportation and so on. So, this increase in the customs duty in turn would make petrol and diesel costly and thus have an adverse impact on the consumers, particularly when the per capita income of the individuals has got reduced on account of the COVID-19 pandemic. Hence, in a way, this particular article is critical of the fact that the government has decided to increase the customs duty, particularly when the Indian economy is facing the economic slowdown. Apart from this, the article also has made reference to two chapters from the volume 1 of the economic survey. This article, for example, discusses the nature of relationship between growth and income inequality in the Indian economy, and it also discusses about the public debt sustainability in India. Now, both these articles from the volume 1 of the economic survey have already been covered by us in the separate economic survey video discussion. As you can see in this particular video discussion, we have discussed this particular chapter as to whether growth lead to debt sustainability. Apart from that, we had also discussed a question which is likely to be asked from this particular chapter, that is, examine the nature of relationship between public debt and GDP growth rates. What factors determine the sustainability of debt in a developing country such as India? So after going through this particular discussion of ours, you should be in a position to write an answer to this particular main space question. Apart from that, we had also covered the chapter of income inequality and growth, wherein we had discussed as to whether these two factors, whether they are in conflict or in convergence in case of India. So we had taken examples of both US as well as Indian economy in order to understand the nature of relationship between income inequality and the GDP growth rate. Further, we had also taken up two main space questions for the practice from this particular chapter. So in order to understand the article in today's newspaper in much greater detail, I suggest you to go through these two chapters which have already been covered in our economic survey video. Now the next article appears on page number 7. The article is titled as Languages in Danger. This article shall be important from the perspective of prelims under the subsection of current events of international importance. Every year, February 21st is celebrated as the International Mother Language Day. In this regard, recently UNESCO published a report known as the Atlas of the World's Languages. I hope all of you must have read about the Red List, which is published by IUCN. The Red List published by IUCN basically provides us with the details of various wildlife species which are critically endangered or on the verge of extinction. Similar to that, the UNESCO Atlas of World's Languages provides us with the details of various languages which are under critically endangered category or have gone extinct. Globally, almost around 7,000 languages are spoken. Out of these 7,000 languages, approximately around 2,500 languages, they are on the verge of extinction. This is primarily on account of the social, political and economic transformation that has been taking place at the global level. Now just like how you have different categories under the IUCN Red List, even under the Atlas of the World's Languages, you have different categories based upon which the languages are categorized. For example, a language is categorized as safe if a language is spoken by all the generations and the intergenerational transmission takes place smoothly without any kind of interruption. Now, all those languages which are considered to be safe, they are not included in the atlas. The vulnerable languages are those languages which are predominantly spoken by the children, but it is restricted only to their homes. The definitely endangered category include those languages wherein children no longer learn these languages as their mother tongue in their homes. Next is the severely endangered category. The severely endangered category basically include all those languages that are normally spoken by the grandparents and the older generations. However, the parent generation may understand it, but they do not speak it to their children, or they may not use it as a language of communication among themselves. The next is the critically endangered languages. Now, the critically endangered languages happens to be those languages in which the youngest speakers happens to be the grandparents or the older generation, and these grandparents or the older generation may speak the language only partially and infrequently. The last category include the extinct languages. This basically includes those languages wherein we do not have any speakers left. Now such extinct languages are included in the atlas only when such a language has become extinct after 1950s. Now according to the latest edition of the Atlas of the World's Languages, unfortunately India tops the list with 197 endangered languages. India is followed by US and Brazil. As far as the status of the endangered languages in India is concerned, so in case of India, whenever we conduct the census, usually we take into account only those languages which have more than 10,000 speakers.
So if a language has less than 10,000 speakers, it is usually not considered in the Indian census. Now, according to the Atlas of the World's Languages, more than 50% of the India's endangered languages have less than 10,000 speakers. And these endangered languages are actually not recorded in the Indian census. And as highlighted before, India has the highest number of endangered languages across the world. Now, more than 60% of these endangered languages are mainly spoken in Andaman and Nicobar Islands and the northeastern part of India. Among the Union territories, which has the highest number of endangered languages, at the top we have the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which has almost around 11 critically endangered languages. And among the states, it is Manipur, and Manipur is followed by Himachal Pradesh. Now, these are some of the important aspects rated to the UNESCO's Atlas of the World's Languages report. The next article appears on page number 10. The article is titled as Indradhanush 3.0 to fill the gap in the immunization due to COVID. Now, this particular article highlights that the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare has recently launched the intensified mission Indradhanush 3.0 in order to cover the children and the pregnant women who missed the routine immunization during the COVID-19 pandemic. Hence, this article shall be important mainly with respect to prelims under the subsection of government schemes and initiatives. Apart from that, this article is also important because, as you can see in prelims 2016, we had this direct question related to the mission Indradhanush. Hence, as part of this particular video analysis, we'll understand as to what is mission Indradhanush and how the intensified mission Indradhanush is different from the mission Indradhanush. See, the mission Indradhanush was launched in the year 2014 in order to provide for the affordable and accessible healthcare to all the citizens of the country. The objective of this particular mission is to fully immunize more than 89 lakh children who are either not vaccinated or partially vaccinated under the Universal Immunization Program. The target group under this particular mission is children under 2 years of age and the pregnant women. As far as the prelims is concerned, you should basically note the list of vaccines which are covered under the mission Indradhanush. Totally, the mission Indradhanush provides for vaccination against 12 vaccine preventable diseases. These diseases include diphtheria, whooping cough, tetanus, polio, tuberculosis, hepatitis B, meningitis, pneumonia, Haemophilus influenza type B infection, Japanese encephalitis, rotavirus vaccine, and pneumococcal conjugate vaccine and measles rubella vaccine. Out of these 12 vaccines, Japanese encephalitis as well as Haemophilus influenza type B infections, the vaccines for these two diseases are presently given only in certain selected districts of India. The remaining 10 vaccines are made available in all the districts. In particular, this particular mission lays a special emphasis on 201 high focus districts where the vaccination coverage is quite lower. Under the mission Indradhanush, the target was to achieve full immunization coverage to 90% by the end of December 2018. But by the end of December 2018, only 16 districts in India achieved 90% coverage. So, we were not able to meet the targets under the mission Indradhanush. Hence, in order to intensify our efforts, in order to achieve higher immunization coverage, the government launched the Intensified Mission Indradhanush program in the year 2017. In particular, the Intensified Mission Indradhanush seeks to lay a special emphasis on the urban areas where the immunization coverage is lower. In particular, it focuses more on those districts where the immunization coverage is 70% or below. So these are some of the important aspects which one needs to know as far as the prelims examination is concerned. With this, we have come to the end of today's discussion. Now the answer to the question, that was asked in yesterday's DNS is option D.